Welcome to the Assembling Inclusion podcast. On this show, we feature different programs, individuals, and initiatives focused on being more inclusive of individual needs. We invite you to learn right alongside us. If you want some additional resources or access to our courses, please visit our website or follow us on social media. But for right now, let's get right to the episode. In this episode, we're going to be talking all about the Disability Lab with Nate Tilton. The Disability Lab is a space at UC Berkeley, almost like a disability makerspace. Nate and I discuss all about the lab, from its creation to its role as an identity makerspace for disabled students, to the design of the lab space and the accessibility of the equipment and the different projects that have been worked on and are currently being worked on. We also dive into other conversations about disability in higher education and the Disability Lab's involvement with other groups on campus. So let's take a listen. Welcome back to the Assembling Inclusion podcast. Today we're going to be talking to Nate Tilton all about the Disability Lab, which is on the campus of UC Berkeley. So Nate, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me here, Katie. I really appreciate it.
So I know that the Disability Lab has been a part of the UC Berkeley campus since 2018, but what was the inspiration for actually creating this space?
So long story short, my boss and the director and founder of the UC Berkeley Disability Lab, Dr. Karen Nakamura, he looked around at a lot of the issues facing disabled folks, and being an openly disabled person herself, she's just like, we don't have a makerspace for ourselves. Let's make this, right? And that's, I felt, what really led her to advocate to creating this space. And it's really one of just a handful in the world. And so it's a really cool space to be in and an awesome space to work in, because it's not just makerspace, right? We don't just make things there. It's also an identity makerspace where a lot of our lab fellows really discover their own disability identity in these spaces.
I love that phrase, identity makerspace. It's more than just the physical building of items, but you're building your own identity. That's a really great phrase.
For myself, I've been disabled my entire life, neurodivergent, and I didn't really realize it until much later in life. I was undiagnosed my entire childhood to adulthood until the last couple of years. The lab really helped me explore my own disability identity. I'm a disabled veteran, but I'm also more than that too, right? I'm a service dog handler. I'm a power chair user. That's another reason why in the lab we use disability pronouns, because it's about our identity. Like, for instance, I use identity first language, so I identify as a disabled person. But then also on top of that, I'm not just a disabled person. I'm a service dog handler. I'm a chair user. I'm neurodivergent. I'm a disabled veteran. And so it really helped me to really tease out what my disability identity is and really helped me to embrace it. I felt it really helped me transition from the military and really embrace being a disabled person, because it was really difficult for me at first. I went from being a very able-bodied, active person, running 2 miles a day and just working out all the time, and I couldn't do that anymore. I really had to come to terms with that, and I felt the lab really helped me understand just to be kinder to myself and to embrace this new me, right? We're just constantly changing, but then also learning to be flexible. I can still work out. It's just I've had to do it in a different way. It's definitely been a really awesome place to be in, and a really fortunate place to be for the last, been there since 2018. So it's 2023. What is that, 5 years now? Yeah, I've been here for 5 years. So geez, it goes by quick.
I was gonna say, that's been a while. And so what actually brought you to the lab space itself? It sounds obviously like a really incredible place where everybody can kind of learn more about themselves and their disability, but what actually made you decide to become part of the Disability Lab while you were at, I'm assuming, undergrad, right?
Yes. I transferred to UC Berkeley in 2018 from one of the local community colleges out here in the Bay Area. And as a junior transfer, I was a lot older than my fellow undergrads. And so I did a lot of research, just checking out all the stuff, because UC Berkeley has a lot of stuff to offer that undergrads and graduate students and postdocs can do. And so I was just like, all right, let me check this out. I found this thing called a URAP, which is an undergraduate research apprenticeship program, which I think is a really interesting thing. And basically, long story short, as a URAPper, you have the potential to work with faculty on their projects or graduate students on their projects. And so I happened to look on the URAP website and I found Dr. Nakamura's page on there for the Disability Lab, and they were looking for URAP people for undergraduate research apprentices. And so I was like, okay, let me check this out. So I applied for it and I applied for a few more. Once you apply, then they review it, then you interview. And I interviewed with one, which was for archaeology and it was working with a graduate student. It was a really cool project, I thought. But then I interviewed with Dr. Nakamura, and that was it. It was me and one other guy. And she was just like, hey, look, this is the first iteration. The lab is not officially built yet. And we're going to be meeting in coffee shops. And I was just like, wow, okay, I guess, yeah, sure, let's do it. And so that was it. The rest is kind of history. We worked in coffee shops, like we were working on this project called the Free Beeps project, which we're using microcontrollers like Arduinos. And Arduinos are basically like these little board doohickeys that you'll hook up all this stuff to. And it's pretty cool. Like you can do a lot of different things with them. Like you can make video game controllers out of them. You can make air sensor monitors out of them, infrared sensors. We happen to make a proximity detecting system for like backup, like basically like for power chairs or power scooters, where they can just basically sit on the back of the power chair or power scooter and do a proximity detector, so that way you can tell how many feet you have behind you to like back up, because most power chairs and power scooters don't have that capability. So we were just like, okay, let's do that. So we call it like the Free Beeps project, and it's an open source thing. It's part of our Cryptcraft line of projects. That's Cryptcraft, copyright Dr. Nakamura, as she likes to tell me. It's really cool though. Like you'd back up and it would just be like, it gives a proximity alert. So it'd be like beep, beep, beep. And you can tell by the beeps, by the sound. It was cool though, because the technology was very flexible. So even if you were deaf or hard of hearing, if you could attach the proximity alert and do a visual detection system and like attach it to either like near your wheelchair control, or you could attach it next to like your power scooter control system, so that way it's in front of you and you can visually detect how much room you have behind you. Sometimes it's difficult to look behind you or whatever may be going on.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah, so that was kind of like one of the first projects we were working on. Another project were working on at the time was the Blind Arduino project, which was in cooperation with Dr. Josh Milne, who is really awesome, blind acoustics engineer. Long story short, it was the goal of the project was to come up with a system, because the problem with their Arduinos themselves, though, they're very visually based. And so for blind and low vision users, it can be a pain in the butt to use. So that was the project, is basically how to make this accessible to blind and low vision users. And so that was part of the project. And it's still an ongoing project that Dr. Josh is working on now. And also Dr. Josh is a recent recipient of the MacArthur Genius Grant Award, and he's also a fellow in our lab, and really just an awesome all-around pleasure to work with. He's also an accessibility expert, I believe, at Amazon as well. He works there. So a lot of the stuff you'll see coming up for accessibility-wise on Amazon, a lot of it is coming from him. So glad to see that the bigger name corporations are starting to push out accessibility.
That's really awesome. Wow. And there's a lot of really interesting projects then going on within the lab space right now. I was looking at that on the website at the projects page and all the different types of projects that either, I guess, had been done or are currently being done. And there were a lot of really innovative ideas within there. I did see Free Beeps on there.
We've had some other projects too that were really cool as part of our Cryptcraft projects. Like for instance, the waterproof controller project, because a lot of power chairs are not waterproof, which I feel is a really frustrating thing. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I mean, it makes sense, I think, economically for the manufacturers, but I think for the user, it's a crappy design. And I was actually at a conference in Washington, D.C., and myself and Ella, who is the ADA coordinator here at Cal, we were talking about the issues facing disabled parents. And I was fortunate to meet Representative Jim Levine, I believe. He's from Rhode Island. And he has a really cool power chair. Like it like allows him to stand up and do all this really cool stuff. And one of the things I asked him, I said, hey, sir, your power chair is really cool, but I gotta ask, how much was that power chair? He was like, oh, maybe $100,000 or something like that. It's a really expensive chair. I was like, is it waterproof? And he's like, I don't think it is. And I'm like, that's because they aren't. Most power chairs are not waterproof. And so that was kind of the motivation behind that project there. A lot of our projects come from the community. They come from our own experiences where we're just kind of like, hey, this would be really cool, right? Or this would be really interesting to check out or to explore. And that's what's awesome about the lab too, is that it's not just people making stuff for disabled people, but it's people in the community making for the community. And I think that's a really powerful part of being in a lab.
That is really amazing. And that's something that I was reading on the website, but there was the quote about how the lab was specifically disability centered and that they really wanted to make sure that actual disabled users were at the heart of the project. So I think that's very clear through those examples, like the people are bringing in their own experiences into the projects, which is really important because you're right. It's not much use if you don't have the experience yourself. You don't know what people need and you don't want to guess. It's great that it's so focused on the users themselves of like these products.
That's just one of our big things because all too often people make stuff for the disabled community, and it's unfortunately it always just goes back to money. We understand that money makes the world go around in a lot of ways, but that's also highly problematic at the same time because it's like most disabled folks are lived on fixed incomes. And so it's like, okay, here's this really cool technology, really all shiny and brand new. And it's like, okay, cool. But we can't afford that. Or it's going to put it all the burdens on the disabled person to provide their own accessibility, right? Which is another thing that's problematic. But
So I know you had mentioned at the beginning the lab wasn't fully formed when you first started. What does it look like now?
the lab as a space now is pretty cool. We've put a lot of work into it. We have hydraulic tables. So the tables lift, for instance, our conference table, because the lab is a multi-use space. Like on one end, it is a maker space, it is identity maker space, but it's also a conference room. It's also a classroom. And so it serves at all these different spaces. It's just a flexible space in reality. And so our conference table is hydraulic. So it actually goes up, it goes down. So that way everyone can get a seat at the table, literally and figuratively also. And then our equipment, for instance, also sits on hydraulic tables. If somebody needs to use our Tormach 770 CNC lathe, if they want to make some parts, that's fine. They can. It's built on a hydraulic table. So that way, if a chair user needs to use it, they just bring it down to whatever level they need it to be at. A lot of times, a lot of traditional maker spaces, what they'll do is like assign a helper basically, or an assistant to help out. And that's kind of like what the accommodation will be. Like, for instance, if I'm a STEM student and I'm an engineer, I want to make something in this makerspace. Well, oftentimes what they'll do is they'll be like, okay, well, here's so and so to help you do this. But that's the thing where it's like, hey, I don't really need someone's help. It's just the equipment's not accessible to me, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so that's what we're doing is we buy this equipment, but we're also making it accessible. For instance, we just bought a laser cutter, but the laser cutter hood is too heavy for a lot of people, including chair users, especially because depending on the height of the laser cutter plus the height of the user for the chair or whatever have you, because they may not be able to work or if they're quadriplegic or whatever the case may be. So that's why we're actually switching out the hood and putting a different hood in that is more accessible. That's just kind of a quick rundown of the way that we have it kind of built. But that's why we're also making our equipment that way that it can be accessible and used by anyone in the community. It's just a really cool thing because I've been to a lot of different maker spaces, including the traditional maker spaces. And a lot of times, there's a joke we have on campus, at least at Berkeley, and we joke that there are no disabled STEM students at Cal, or at least in the engineering fields, because the outside of campus is just so inaccessible in a lot of ways, where it sets us on this really high hill. There's a really bad grade. The terrain is just very not disability friendly. And then you go into the makerspace itself, and it's like built in a certain way that it's just not disability friendly in a lot of ways. And it's kind of like, why would I want to be here? And that's another thing, right? If a place is not built for you, then why would you be there, right? And that's kind of like this vibe it gives off. It's kind of like, yeah, you don't really belong here. Our lab is on the other side of campus, where it's flat. It has access to several accessible parking spots. It also has access to public transportation. We're also like just a couple doors down from the brand new Cal Disability Community Cultural Center, which is right down from us, probably like two doors down. And we just actually had an event with them a couple days ago, and we had some students from middle school come in, and they were doing a field trip at the Disability Cultural Center, and then they had a field trip over at our lab, and we had them prototyping some pretty cool stuff. It was really cool to see these young people get really excited about disability and design, and it just kind of really gives me hope for the future in a lot of ways that we can teach them about disability while they're young, and that I think will make things different hopefully in the future.
Oh yeah, I could definitely see that. The younger we could teach them about those types of things, I could see that being impactful for the future. I was going to ask about that because I was doing some snooping through the social media feeds, and I did see that you had done the event with the Disability Cultural Center, and I was like, oh, that's a really nice partnership. I wasn't sure if that was something that was new or something that had been happening, but I guess that was the first you had said.
Yeah, so there's also, just like the lab, there's only a handful of disability cultural centers throughout the
Mhm.
US, let alone the world. And Cal's is brand new. It was won through student advocacy, namely Elena Morales and Katie Savin, who really put in a lot of work, not just to mention them, but also quite a few other advocates. I'm happy to report that I'm on the University of California system-wide work group on disabled students or students with disabilities. And we're really pushing change in the University of California system. And one of the things that we're all agreeing upon is that all the UC schools need to have their own disability cultural center. We keep telling them, and this is a big point that was the Disability Cultural Center was founded on, that it's community and not legislation. It's the
Mhm.
community. People talk about, well, what about your accommodations, or what about the disabled students programs or disabled student center? And it's like that's not the same. That's all built on legislation. That's not community. I mean, we may have community members there, and they may be allies, but that's not the community. We need our own center, just like you have all these other spaces for identity groups. Why don't we have one? Disability is intersectionality, just like anything else. And yeah, it was a long fought battle. Katie and Elena really fought for that for a number of years. I was on the hiring committee. I was fortunate to be on it. And we hired Anne, who is a really amazing low vision person. I believe she has her ED in, I forget what part of education she has it in, but yeah, she's a Cal alum, and she got her ED, I believe, at UC Santa Barbara. And she's just been really awesome and amazing to work with. And we've partnered on a couple different projects here and there. And it's the first year for the DCCC, so we're definitely excited for it. And that's a really awesome space too to be in. And like I said, we're just down the road, or just down the hall from each other, so it's pretty nice.
It's nice to be in close proximity. That's really cool because I had a list of a couple disability cultural centers at universities, but yeah, it was a very small list. That's pretty
Yeah,
impressive that you have both the lab and the center like in one space. That's pretty incredible.
yeah, it's frustrating when I was applying to PhD programs. One of the things I learned, because I'm a Fireball scholar when I was an undergrad, and the most important thing I think I learned from one of my mentors in the Fireball program was look around at the people that are in the cohorts now. Do they look like you? Do they sound like you? Do you feel you can build a community with them there? Because grad school can be a very lonely place. And I took that to heart. That made me really look at where I was applying to and the schools I was applying to. And I would reach out to different places. Like, for instance, I had a really big interest in University of Washington because they have a disability cultural center there. But I contacted them, but no one ever got back to me. I'm like, is this thing even still here? Did it go to my spam? I did some campus visits there to the University of Washington, and it was one of the schools I was fortunate to get into, and they were definitely on the list. But it was just one of those things where I was like, dang, what's up with this? It always goes back to funding, and I think that's the most difficult part of it all. Is it's just like the lack of funding available, because then I feel a lot of ways they say, well, you need to choose. That was one of the things in the UC system wide group that I'm in, we were discussing, because we have people who are CSP counselors, they do people's accommodations. And so they were talking about us, like they're worried that like building these disability cultural centers will take out of their funding. And it's like, why should that be the case? Why should these two organizations be posed against each other? And what Elena and Katie have been saying is that it's community, not compliance, because compliance is just the floor. Community is community. You can't really compare those two in that same breath. There's two different things, and having that community there is priceless. That's one of the things that we want to tell the University of California system, because it's not just me and a couple of their students. These people are vice chancellors and professors and a lot of other people who have different intersectionality and connecting parts to disability. And we all agree that all the UCs need a disability cultural center. But now, and then, but we've been talking too, it's like, how do we get the funding? And that's the bigger question. It's like, how do we fund it? And I'm like, hey, it should not take away from the disabled students program. That's compliance. That has nothing to do with this. This is a community group. It's like trying to figure out how to get the funding, and navigating that, I think, is difficult a lot of times, because that's what it goes down to, even with K through 12 schools, right? You have the issues with funding. Ella Callow, who I've advocated with several times, different things. She's the coordinator at UC Berkeley, and she's also an openly disabled person. One of the things that we talked about is having a centralized account for compliance, where it's all the UCs, like all their disability student programs, would just draw from one single account, or all the special education programs would just draw from one single account through the state, versus having to wait for the money to filter down from somebody else. And that could hopefully help.
It's always the funding. It always comes back to it somehow. And it seems like it's never done right.
And that's the frustrating part. Yeah.
Even in K-12, it's hard with the funding. That's always a challenge. But I'm really impressed with the fact that UC Berkeley has the cultural center. That's really incredible. Like, that managed to happen.
Well, it's one of those things, I feel, where we've definitely been fortunate to have the amazing student advocates here on campus, such as Elena and Katie, and now we have other ones that are stepping up. It's just really awesome. Like, for instance, one of our big advocates, he just started his PhD program at Vanderbilt, and I know Vanderbilt is very lucky to have him there. So we're just really fortunate, I feel, to have just a strong disabled community. Problem, though, is how do we bring that to all the schools, right? Because we can't expect everybody to get into Cal and be able to afford it, because there's also a privilege in being able to come here, because state tuition is ridiculously overpriced. My goodness. I guess it's one of those things that that's something that the lab does too, is we're trying to create models that other people and institutions could replicate and use it successfully, that could make their institutions a place for disabled folks also.
I did want to ask about, because I know that in addition to the projects that the Disability Lab has right now within the research, you also have on the website different educational resources. Like, I saw there was a full lesson plan about the idea of inspiration porn within the disability community and like how to avoid that. And I'm like, oh, this is a perfect example of a lesson plan that you could give to administrators who are trying to push that type of viewing experience on their staff, and it isn't effective. But I really wanted to know about the decision specifically to include those resources like on the Disability Lab website itself.
That's actually one of the projects that have come out of the lab. That was the brainchild of Elle, who is one of our awesome disability advocates on campus. And the question was like, how do we bring a community center, like a disability community center, to middle and high schools? I feel a big part of the reason why it was constructed that way with that lesson plan, to be like, look, it's an achievable thing that you can bring to high schools, and this is how you can do it, or to middle schools, and this is how you could do it. And here's kind of an example. Because like I said, a lot of our stuff is open source. So we want people to be able to just be like, hey, we can do this.
I love that everything is so open source and accessible. That just makes it even more, there's almost like not an excuse then for like places that want to try it. Like, it's available, it's here, it's not behind a paywall, the resources are there, you should be taking advantage and looking at it.
Exactly. I mean, we've been definitely having those conversations in the lab too. What does it mean to be open source and stuff like that? And I guess at the end of the day, all we're asking is just like, hey, just give us a shout out, just give us a credit for it. We're not asking for money. Just be like, oh, hey, I got the idea from the Disability Lab at Berkeley, or something like that. That's all we're asking.
Give the credit back where it's due.
Yeah, that's it. I feel that's better than the paywall in a lot of ways, because then it goes back to like a community system. Because our goal is we want people to get what we're doing, and we want them to improve on it. We want them to change it, make it better, make it for themselves, for their space, for their community. Because when we're making we're making normally specifically for this area here, but we want it to be able to be used, let's say, in somewhere in Asia or Africa. We want it to be able to be used, and that's why we try to make it so flexible, because we want people to be able to take it and just make it their own and be able to hack it, right? Because that's one of our big things is hacking, and we hack our environment and we hack our technology, and in this way, we're also hacking the institution.
I like that. That's a good way to phrase it. It really does come back to that idea of it's one giant community then working together to take something that's working and bring it into someone else's life and somewhere else around the world. My last question for you was, the Disability Lab is doing a lot of different projects and initiatives, and there's so much going on. But I always like to end with, what are you seeing or anticipating for the future with the Disability Lab? Whether it's research or just getting involved with other organizations or advocacy work.
The ultimate goal I feel right now is obviously we want to make awesome stuff with the community, and we also want to be able to expand. We would really like to have a new disability cultural center pops up. Like, we want a disability lab to pop up with it. I go on disability Twitter, at least before Elon bought it. And one of the things I saw that a lot of the disabled STEM folks were talking about is like, hey, look, I go to a lab and they can't even accommodate me. I'm supposed to be working on this for my dissertation and I'm screwed. And I feel like having a space like this could actually be really helpful, because then it's like, oh, hey, here's your person for your dissertation, but you have access to the disability lab to do your work. And I feel that can be a really awesome space to really help communities too. So we had talked about expanding with some friends of ours at other University of Californias to do other things, not just technology labs, but also like performance and stuff. We were talking with Dr. Megan Moody about that, who's an awesome professor at UC Santa Cruz. She's also openly disabled, and talked about doing like a disability performance lab. And then we'd be like working together in tandem.
Oh, I love that.
On the advocacy front, with the system-wide committee group that I'm working with, I advocated for the UC Regents, the University of California Regents, who are pretty much the people that run the University of California system in tandem with the University of California Office of the President. Back in like 2020, I advocated before them with a good friend of mine, Sarita Nolan, and we were advocating before them. And one of the things I brought up was that we're 30 years past the ADA and y'all are still not really in compliance. And I was just like, how long do we really have to wait? Right. And so at that point, I challenged them. I said, hey, look, I challenge you in the next 10 years to become compliant, to become not just compliant, but also be in with the spirit of the law. And so after that, they formed a committee, the work group, which I'm a part of. And so I'm hoping we can definitely bring more accommodations available to undergrad and graduate students and postdocs and professional students, and hopefully, just make the campuses more available to disabled folks, and not just on the UC campuses, but hopefully we could serve this as a blueprint for higher ed and K through 12. Yeah. But then again, like you said, it all goes back to the budget. So
it always does, but that's still really incredible.
One of the things I'm trying to get past right now is basic accommodation in undergrad and grad school is like a reduced course load, right? But then as a disabled undergrad or grad student, you kind of penalize when you think about it, because then you have to pay more. Like, how can you have an accommodation of reduced course load, which allows you to have more time, but you still have to pay more money? And as a graduate student at Berkeley, you get money from fellowships or stipends or the department or wherever it is. It's kind of like a penalty when you think about it. It's like, okay, this is a penalty for me taking a reduced course load, which doesn't make any sense. So now we're exploring the ideas of creating fellowships for disabled graduate students and undergrads, possibly. But if you have 5 years to complete it, maybe this would give you 7 years to complete it. So that way you get like an extra 2 years of funding. We're exploring these options. And so that's kind of like the ultimate goal currently.
I love that. That's a really great idea. I didn't even think about that, but that's true. You're getting penalized financially, even though it's your accommodation. That's really terrible.
Right? That doesn't make any sense, right? Like, I was just kind of like,
sense.
yeah, I was thinking about that because a buddy of mine, he was like 6th year in his undergrad. And I was just kind of thinking about that. I was like, dude, you got to pay for that? And he's like, yeah. I was like, dude, that's messed up. What the heck? I know a lot of disabled graduate students who end up mastering out because they're just like, I couldn't afford it anymore. I just had to master out. I feel that's another reason why there's also a lot less disabled academics and professionals, because higher ed can be so inaccessible that they're just like, yeah, you're not going to get this.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Assembling Inclusion podcast. I hope the information in this episode taught you something new, gave you a new idea, or showcased a new perspective. If you liked the episode, feel free to leave us a review or comment. If you have a recommendation for an individual or an organization who would make a great guest, you can message us on Twitter or Instagram, or send us an email at assemblinginclusion@gmail.com. See you next time.